Did you know that there's only three questions you have to answer when it comes to figuring out compatibility between a skid steer and an attachment? My name is Mike Reese. I've been in the heavy equipment industry for half a decade. I've sold over $7 million worth of heavy equipment. I had an e-commerce company that doubled every single year that it was open for all of the years that it was open. And I built and now run Matchpoint Intelligence, a fully universal compatibility matching engine and analytics platform for heavy machinery vehicles and attachments. So let's dig in. The only thing that matters when you're figuring out compatibility for a skid steer and attachment is the laws of physics. And if we know that, then we only have to answer three questions. One, can the skid steer connect to the attachment? Two, can the skid steer power the attachment? And three, can the skid steer lift the attachment? I'm going to go into detail about what each of these means and what you have to look at on the skid steer and on the attachment to figure them out. Can the skid steer connect to the attachment? Now, the easy and obvious thing here is going to be the attachment interface of the skid steer. Skid steers usually have a universal quick attach, a universal mount that's just like industry standard across every manufacturer and every individual, every company who manufactures attachment as well. So that one's generally pretty easy, but this is where the attachment will physically hook onto the skid steer. Now there are some smaller skid steers that do not have this, like very, very small Bobcats actually use a mini attach plate. By and large, you're gonna be okay, but definitely make sure you double check this stuff. The second thing you need to know about can it connect is it also extends to things like hose couplings and wire harnesses. So hose couplings, again, this is also generally industry standard. There's a company called Faster that makes the hydraulic manifold that all of the hoses and stuff work into between like most skid steers. So they generally have the quick connects. That's what you'll see them termed as. They're flat-faced quick couplers. Those are generally industry standard, but you do need to know the sizing of like the inflow, outflow, and then if there's a K-strain, the size of that as well. But again, those are usually industry standard, so you don't have to do too much about that. The last thing is going to be the wire harness. Now, this isn't industry standard. There are different wire harness and pin configurations for different vehicles. Like Bobcat has a 7-pin, Cat has a 14-pin, things like that. There's another little trick you can use is if you don't know your wire harness and if you don't want to hook it up to the wire harness, which you should do, by the way, because you want to use your joystick controls, and that's what lets you do that. But you can also get something that has like a cigarette plug and plug it into like your 12-volt cigarette plug and power something that way. So that's going to be can it connect. Now, can it power? This is the big one, and this is usually where we find disqualifications for attachments that are powered. So the two big things that you need to know are the hydraulic flow and the hydraulic pressure. This is both on the skid steer side and on the attachment side. Now, on the skid steer side, you're just going to get a single number. So if you have standard flow, it's going to say you put out 16.1 gallons per minute, right? For hydraulic pressure, it's going to say you might have like an overflow pressure or something like that. And that'll be usually 3,000 PSI or 3,500 PSI. Sometimes on the very, very high flow skid steers, you get up to 4,000 PSI. On the attachment side of things, you're going to get a range. So an attachment's motor is going to be capable of operating at like maximum effectiveness in a given range. And the manufacturer basically guarantees that if you are in that range, you will get optimum performance. So for a brush cutter, for example, it might say 20 to 30 gallons per minute. So if you have a skid steer that puts out 23.1 gallons per minute, you're going to get optimal performance out of that brush cutter. The second thing is that manufacturers usually don't list it, but they do generally have like a pressure maximum. And it's usually a little bit higher than what skid steers put out. And the reason for that is that for powered attachments, if you do get a spike of some kind, say you have a brush cutter and you hit a rock and it stops the brush cutter in that moment, that pressure is going to have to go somewhere, and it's usually going to go back into the motor. And for higher powered attachments, you're going to have a K-strain that feeds that fluid back into your hydraulic reservoir for your skid steer. Now, again, these are generally built out with specifications that are built to handle most skid steers in that range. So you won't really need to worry about it, but you do want to check if you have a skid steer that is like under or overpowered for its like size range. And just make sure with the manufacturer that you're speaking to, like, hey, I have this hydraulic pressure on machine. Is that going to work with your attachment? Do I need a K-strain? Is really what the pressure is going to indicate to you. Now, the third thing, can it lift it? This is relatively easy and obviously very intuitive. If you can't physically lift the attachment, it doesn't matter if you can connect to it. It doesn't matter if you can power it. You're going to be either in danger or you're not even going to be able to use it. So on the skid steer side of things, you will be given two different measurements for how much you can lift. There's going to be something either called the lift capacity or the tipping load. These are the same things, and it is what it sounds like. This is the maximum amount of weight that if you put it on it, your skid steer will tip over. Now, this is not the number that you use. Do not use this number. This is just for like specifications saying like, hey, this tipped over at this number. What you're going to be using is something called a rated operating capacity, and that's an industry standard term. The rated operating capacity for a skid steer that has wheels is usually about 50% of the tipping load. And the reason for that is that if you're carrying something and you're on a hill or you're on an incline or you're like lifting something above and there's a tilt or some kind of thing like that, that is a safety buffer so that you don't tip over and roll over and potentially harm yourself or damage your equipment. On compact track loaders, the rated operating capacity is about 35% of the tipping load. But skid steers, it's usually about 50%. But the number that you're going to use when you look at your skid steer specs, either on the manufacturer website or in the brochure that they give you, is the rated operating capacity. That is the number that's going to tell you how much you can lift. On the attachment side of things, what you need to know is the weight all in. So for things that are destructive attachments that don't carry material, if you're looking at a mulcher or a brush cutter or something like an auger or something like that, all you need to know is the weight of the entire unit, right? And if that weight is less than your rated operating capacity, you are golden. If you're looking at something like a bucket or something that is intended to carry material in it, you're going to need to have an estimation of how much that material weighs. You can usually do this by like the cubic yard capacity of the bucket, and make sure that the attachment weight plus the material weight isn't over your rated operating capacity. Generally, buckets are pretty light. Like you'll see buckets that are like 500 pounds, and a Bobcat T770 will have like a rated operating capacity of about 3,500 pounds. So it's going to be very difficult unless you're like lifting something insanely dense. It's going to be very difficult to actually go over that rated operating capacity, but you do need to know what it is and how it works. And that's it. That's literally it. If you can answer those 3 questions, it doesn't matter what the attachment is. It doesn't even matter if it's made for a skid steer. If you have a mechanism to connect, to power, and to lift the attachment, you can use that attachment with your vehicle.